Hello, welcome to Voces. I am Luis Ortiz. It is June 20th, and we're back with Brazil. The political scenario in Brazil keeps deteriorating. On the one hand, we have the erratic response of the Bolsonaro government towards the pandemic, which by now has claimed more than 1 million cases and 50,000 deaths. It is really astonishing to see not just the negligence by the government in the response to the pandemic, but the deliberate intention to go against any scientific recommendation. And on the other hand, there is an institutional clash that is evolving, and Bolsonaro's stand towards democratic institutions it's worrisome. To talk about this, in today's episode, we hear from Brian Winter. He has reported and analyzed the Brazilian politics for many years. He is currently the editor in chief of America's Quarterly and the vice president for policy at the America Society Council of the Americas. Hi, Brian. Thanks for being with us. Welcome to the podcast.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Since Bolsonaro took office, there has been a cascade of issues that constantly emerge in Brazil. I would like to start with the latest one, and perhaps the topic that I thought that we would never talk about. But here we are, and I am referring to these the rumors around a military intervention in behalf of Bolsonaro to retain power. So, is it outrageous to talk about it, or do you see a realistic scenario in which Jair Bolsonaro uses the armed forces to pressure or even shut down the judicial or legislative powers in Brazil?
Look, Luis, I think 2020 is a year where many things that we thought would never be possible are coming to pass. And, with specific regard to this, yes, the talk in Brazil over the last couple of weeks, no matter where you are, has been about this possibility of a coup. And in this case, what we mean is not a coup in the traditional sense, but an autogolpe, right? A self-coup. This really the closest example in recent past would be what Alberto Fujimori did in Peru in the early 1990s, where he used, with the support of the military, he was able to, in his case, close Congress. There's speculation that in the Brazilian context, this could mean anything from a full-on closure of either Congress or the Supreme Court, or possibly some other kind of power grab there. I think that it is possible, and I've certainly spent the last several weeks and even months constantly talking to people on the ground in Brasilia in positions of power, trying to gauge from them the likelihood of this. And the current consensus is yes, such a self-coup is possible. It's a risk that should not be dismissed, but it's probably not the most likely scenario. What you're more likely to see is kind of, this less dramatic, more incremental erosion of kind of the quality of democracy, a process that lasts for several years, as opposed to some kind of sudden move, where you see tanks rolling through the streets or something like that. It's not typically how things happen in the 21st century, and really not how things tend to happen in Brazil, which is more a country of kind of slow moves as opposed to something really dramatic like that.
Mm-hmm. But right now in Bolsonaro's government, there are key posts that are held by military personnel.
Right. So, I believe the current ratio is something like 10 out of 23 ministers in his government now are either active duty or retired military. They're in deep. There are people who say that this, in many respects, is kind of a 21st century version of a military government. Certainly, you have civilians in charge. You do not have the armed forces playing an institutional role, at least not officially, in this government. But, perception matters a lot, and good luck convincing Brazilians that that's not the case, right? The perception out there is that this, in many respects, is a government, kind of by and for the armed forces, and so that changes things. And it's worth pointing out that the military feel of this government, that feel has become even more pronounced. The presence of the military has become stronger in the last couple of months as Bolsonaro has come under more intense political pressure from some of these other branches of government as well as the opposition.
Even though the polls show that Bolsonaro has started to lose support, but there still is part of the population supports his rhetoric, his policies. How would you describe the structure of those that still support Jair Bolsonaro after everything that he has said and done?
So it's a good question. And look, Jair Bolsonaro, by the standards of the year 2020, is a relatively popular leader. I mean,
Yeah.
he's more popular than Trump. He's more popular than Piñera. He's, his approval ratings, when you divide it out in terms of strict, when you force Brazilians to pick one of two options, either approve or disapprove, which is not how most polling happens in Brazil, but when you do, that number is in the low 40s. And
Ah,
so
that's
that's,
quite high.
yeah, it's pretty high. And his, his support tends to be concentrated in, this area of Brazil called Centro-Oeste, the center west, which is kind of the soy belt. It's an area that, it's a Brazil that doesn't get shown to foreigners a lot. It's not the Brazil of Rio de Janeiro where you see beaches and favelas and bossa nova and Tom Jobim. This is the Brazil of soy fields and rodeo and sertanejo music, which is like basically Brazil's version of country and western. It's a Brazil that is, where evangelical Christianity is on the rise. It's a Brazil that has a lot in common, or many things in common, with the interior of the United States. Both culturally and in terms of its politics. It's quite conservative, and all the recent polling shows that center west region is where Bolsonaro is strongest. It's areas where people are very anti-abortion, very pro-gun, and where especially the memory of the 13 years in power of the Workers'
Hmm.
Party
Hmm.
from 2003 to 2016, they were very against that, at least at the end, and the memory of that is still very strong.
Hmm. It's striking to me the similarities that we have between Brazil and the current political scenario of the United States, don't you think?
Yeah, it's striking to me too, and I catch some grief for those comparisons sometimes on Twitter and elsewhere, because there are people who in good faith, argue that the similarities aren't that strong and they can be misleading, and I understand that they have a point. There are points where the analogy falls apart, but man, let me tell you, I mean, sometimes the similarities are breathtaking. As somebody who lives in the United States but spends a lot of his working day following Brazil and lived there recently, I lived there from 2010 to 2015. I feel sometimes like I'm watching like similar programs in split screen. I mean, the same tactics, the same signals from supporters. And look, it's not a coincidence. I have good dialogue with people in the conservative world in Brazil. And I know, and including, in sort of Bolsonaro's world, and I know that Bolsonaro watches what Trump does quite closely and tries to imitate it. That's not a secret either, right? I mean, there was this famous photo that came out, or video once, where Bolsonaro did a Facebook Live of himself sitting in front of the television watching Trump give a speech. So he models himself after what Trump does, and
Hmm.
and some of his supporters at least seem to like it.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. We talk a lot about Bolsonaro, what he says and what he does, but we don't pay enough attention to the other side of the field. And my sense is that we don't see a cohesive opposition against Bolsonaro's government. And he obviously tends to capitalize on this. Who do you think has the reins of the opposition at this moment?
Yeah, nobody, and that's an issue right now. It's actually there have been some changes, and there have been some efforts even the last couple of weeks to stitch together a movement of people, manifestos and the like, where you've seen people kind of from the center left and the center right coming together and signing. There was a one recently that included people like Luciano Hucchi, the television host, who some believe could sort of center, or could challenge Bolsonaro from, I suppose you could call it, the ideological center in 2022. But these efforts have been very incomplete, very halting, for one main reason, which is that, the Workers' Party, which I mentioned already, and Lula, the former President Lula in particular, are kind of off by themselves. Determined to do their own thing, determined to mount their own candidacy for 2022. They have just a strong enough support in the polls to kind of make them believe that if things go a certain way, they could take the presidency back. And that's still a very polarizing. Lula is still an extremely polarizing figure, and the PT is a polarizing party. And here we are now, I guess, wow, almost 4 years after impeachment. Is that right? Yeah, 4 years after impeachment, and we're still, the Lula and the PT still remain kind of at the center of that debate on the left side of the spectrum in Brazil. So, here we are. And that has so far at least prevented any kind of united opposition against Bolsonaro.
Talking about political impeachment, do you foresee a realistic possibility of that happening to Bolsonaro in Congress? I mean, he's been losing a lot of support in Congress. That has, by the way, it's astonishing the number of political parties that are part of the Congress in Brazil. But do you see that somehow these parties in Congress could make a decision to impeach Bolsonaro?
So the whole Brazil story right now is kind of one of Bolsonaro being steadily encircled by his enemies, right? And on a related note, by these criminal cases that are being pressed against some of his allies, supporters, and even in the case of his son's family members. And, there are various kind of ways that they're trying to get to him. And that's, by the way, that's what the whole chatter of a military self-coup or military-led self-coup is about, in my mind, is kind of the counterattack, or the clamor for a counterattack by Bolsonaro's supporters, who see kind of the various institutions closing in on them. Now, of course, impeachment would go through Congress, and there's nothing imminent happening on that front, for a couple reasons. The biggest one is there is a sense amongst what I suppose you could call Brazil's old establishment. These are people like Rodrigo Maia, who's the president of the House of Deputies. They currently believe that taking Bolsonaro out, that impeaching him, would be worse than the status quo. That it would plunge the country deeper into crisis at a time where, of course, COVID-19 is just taking a terrible human toll, where the economy is in flames. They just, there's a section of the business establishment that just basically doesn't want to have that conversation. The question is what happens as we get later into 2020, into early 2021, as hopefully at least the pandemic passes. And that's where things become, I think, riskier for Bolsonaro. I think it's, depending on how things go between now and then, there is a real possibility that some of these petitions for impeachment that are currently before the legislature, they might move forward at the end of this year.
Brian Winter, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Luis. Take care.